is up, guys? Welcome to e4 from Black's perspective. So how to deal with this move e4. Real quick, let's flip the board around and look at this board from White's point of view right now. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between playing e4 and a move like d4. When White plays pawn to e4, realize that this pawn is undefended. This means that none of White's pieces are in contact with this center pawn. However, realize that this pawn is defended. It's defended by the queen. So why would White want to play e4 when this pawn isn't defended? Well, for the first part, Black isn't really attacking anything. All of his pieces are still behind pawns, so the fact that it's undefended isn't really a problem. By playing pawn to e4, White now allows two pieces to come out into the game. This light square bishop and the queen, versus when White played d4, it only allows for this dark square bishop to come into the game. Technically, this queen can now also come into the game, but that's going to take multiple moves. So the main point of e4 is to get your pieces out as fast as possible, not really worrying about if your pawns are going to be in danger, because Black doesn't really have an attack set up yet. So now how do we deal with this move e4? The two most popular ways to reply to e4 is e5, the classical king's pawn game, and c5, the Sicilian. For this series, we're just going to deal with the most classical response, e5. And now what is this move doing? For one, we're stopping this pawn from advancing anymore. Let's say we just played a passive move like a6. This can allow e5, and now his pawn has taken over this f6 square. This is the square that our knight would like to come out to naturally. So whenever our opponent gets to our side of the center, like d5 or e5, he'll always control these key squares on c6 and f6. These are the prime squares that our knight wants to go to, so we try to prevent White from ever coming into these squares. So we play e5 here so that White can't play e5 himself and control this f6 square. Another reason we play e5 is to control this d4 square. And we can persuade White not to play d4 himself. If White does play d4, we can take that pawn, and now White no longer has that big pawn duo in the center. Let's say we played a passive move like a6. This can allow White to get a big pawn duo in the center. And now if we try to put a pawn of our own in the center, White can just push, and now White has control over that key c6 square that our knight wants to come into. So we're always going to answer e4 with e5 right away. White's most common continuation here is bringing this knight to f3 and attacking our pawn on e5. This move develops a piece, and it sets up a pretty straightforward plan to get this pawn in the center of the board. We're going to play Black's most common reply here, which is knight to c6, just defending this pawn in the center of the board. We could also play the Russian or the Petrov opening with knight to f6, just attacking, not worrying to defend our own pawn. Or we can play the Philidor here with d6. So whenever you see this knight attack our pawn, realize we have three main moves from here, either playing a Russian, which is very aggressive, counterattacking in the center. We can play a Philidor. This is more of a passive, defensive kind of structure, choosing not to develop a piece, but instead make a strong pawn chain. Or the most common reply, knight to c6, just defending the pawn. Here you'll most likely see White play things like bishop to b5 or bishop to c4. Bishop to b5, which is what we're going to deal with today, is the Spanish. The main idea of the Spanish is that White attacked our pawn with their knight and we defended with our knight. So White is saying if he can just bring out his bishop and trade off this knight, he should be able to just take this pawn in the center of the board. So this is the starting position of the Roy Lopez or the Spanish opening. We're always going to start the Spanish opening with a6. Pawn to a6 is called Morphy's pawn because it was first played by Paul Morphy. a6 attacks the bishop on b5 and gives Black two main options. He can either go back to a4 or he can exchange the bishop for the knight. Let's look at the exchange variation first. So White follows through with the plan of taking this knight, and now we have to know to take back with our center pawn. Usually there's a concept in chess where you want to take pawns towards the center like this, but in this case we want to take with our d pawn so that it opens up our queen to come out. So if white tries to take our e pawn, we can play queen to d4, attacking this knight and attacking this pawn. White has to go back to save his knight, and now we can take our pawn back and the material is even again. I can choose to either lose castling rights here, or he can choose to trade the queens off first, and now he loses castling rights again. We can continue attacking undefended pawns, and on the next move, we're going to get castled, and white's king is kind of exposed in the middle of the board. The game isn't exactly won for black here, but black has a slightly better position, and black was the one to go second, so this is not the best variation for white to pick. So we just looked at knight takes pawn, and we answered this move by playing queen to d4. So what if instead of taking this pawn, white tries to castle away? Now in his next move he can take this pawn, and black won't have any check with queen to d4. We can respond to this position by playing bishop to g4, pinning this knight to the queen. There's no taking this pawn because now white hangs the queen. And if black tries to bat our bishop away by playing h3, we can play h5 and protect our bishop with a pawn. This is called the fishing pole trap, where if white tries to take this bishop, we can take back with our pawn, and now our pawn is attacking this knight. The job of this knight right now is to defend these squares and prevent this queen from coming in to h4. Because this knight is attacked and it sees a vulnerable pawn on e5, white could get greedy here and try to take this pawn. Black can immediately win this game by playing queen to h4, and if white tries to make an escape square for the king, we can always just push our pawn to g3, and now this king is completely blocked in. There's no stopping queen to h1. So that's all for video 1. That's just going to be the basics of the Spanish. Whenever we see e4, we're always going to respond with e5. This prevents white from getting to e5 himself, as well as getting a pawn duo in the center. The most common response here is bringing out this knight, attacking our vulnerable pawn on e5. We're always going to respond to this by bringing out a knight of our own, and now this allows the Roy Lopez or the Spanish opening with bishop to b5. Whenever we see this, we play Morphy's pawn, a6, putting into question where this bishop should go. Retreating is generally thought as too passive for white, so white usually decides between going to a4 and exchanging off this knight. Let's say white exchanges the knight. We always remember to capture with the d pawn so that this queen is free for tactics. Remember, it's a little bit of a mistake for white to take this pawn because we play queen to d4 and we have a double attack in the center, and we're going to be taking castling rights from white. So instead, white tries to castle away, and now we can go for a fishing pole trap with bishop to g4, pinning this knight to the queen. If at any time this queen tries to undo the pin, realize we can take this knight, and white would have to take back with the g-pawn, ruining his pawn structure in front of the king. So white tries to undo this pin by playing h3, but we can just keep the pressure on with h5. We don't mind losing this bishop because now we're attacking this very important knight. And if the knight ever leaves this square, we can now play queen to h4, and there's no stopping this mate on h1.